You're good. Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the IR and Ethics panel for this year's School of Security Studies Research Conference. My name is Rebekka Friedman. I'm a senior lecturer in the War Studies Department and theme lead for the IR and Ethics Research theme. I'm delighted to be co-chairing this panel, everyone, and welcome to the IR with our theme's PhD representative, Maria Jellinek. The conference theme for this year is Order and Disorder, Navigating Global Crises. The IR and Ethics panel is titled Solidarity During the Global Health Crisis and Beyond, Reimagining Communities. We've decided to focus our conversation this afternoon on solidarity. Solidarity is often invoked in a wide range of public discourses, yet it is not clear what it entails. What is solidarity, and what does it mean to act in solidarity with others? We are thrilled to have 3 very interesting speakers with us here today who will, through the lens of their respective research, explore the notion of what solidarity means and whether it can help us in reimagining communities in a post-pandemic world. Maria will now introduce our excellent speakers and their topics.
Thank you, Rebekka. I'm Maria Jellinek, and I am a PhD candidate here at the department, and I'm also the PhD rep for the IR and Ethics research team. As Rebekka said, we're very pleased to have 3 brilliant speakers with us here today. Our first presenter is Lola Frost. Lola is a practicing artist and a visiting fellow at the Department of War Studies. In her presentation, Lola will explore the contours of an ethics of being in common without identity. Our second presenter is Caroline Fabre. Caroline is a PhD student here at the department, and she will explore how solidarity can be reimagined through the lens of feminist foreign policy. Finally, our third presenter is Eitan Oren, who's a teaching fellow here at the department. Eitan will discuss some challenges for solidarity from the mind's perspective. The format of today is that we will have 3 short presentations examining the subject of solidarity. After this, Rebekka and I will ask our presenters a few questions. Some of these questions will be directed to all of the panelists, while others will be individualized. Finally, we will open up for questions and answers. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat box or raise your hand and you can ask it in person. Please also note that this is being live streamed on YouTube, and you can follow this conversation on Twitter under @KCLSecurity with the hashtag Order and Disorder. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Lola.
Hello. Thank you very much, Maria, for the introduction. I'm just trying to get my slideshow going. Yeah, I am going to talk to you on the topic of being in common without identity. And this presentation explores some of the contours of an ethics of being in common without identity. And my claim that such an ethics is lodged in a multitude of sense-based practices that address and negotiate the problematics and possibilities of mutual recognition in encounter. Sorry, I'm a bit lost here. Can you hear me? I'm just not sure if you can hear me.
We can hear you. You just
Okay,
need to use the share screen button at the bottom of your...
okay, there we go. There we go. There we go. Okay, there we go. So can you see me and can you hear me?
We can see you. You just need to draw up your PowerPoint at the bottom.
Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. There we go. Excellent. Thank you. I just didn't have any notice that I was actually with you. Okay, so the title of my show, my talk is Being in Common Without Identity. And this presentation explores some of the contours of an ethics of being in common without identity. My claim is that such an ethics is lodged in a multitude of sense-based practices that address and negotiate the problematics and possibilities of mutual recognition through encounter. In this paper, I will argue that such a being in common without identity, realized in the aesthetic experience of art, involves the performance of a pluralizing commonality that offers an ethical alternative to those values and practices that service identity politics, securitization, technological control, and cognitive or territorial mastery. In the context of this panel's focus on reimagining communities, my contribution is to argue for the often neglected and repressed potential of a widespread ethics of being in common without identity by focusing on its role in mobilizing processes of mutual recognition with reference to the disordering but transformative effects of aesthetic experience in art. So, time being short, in this presentation, I cannot go into the immense philosophical efforts of the many theorists who have framed the problematics of mutual recognition, encounter, and aesthetic experience. The insights I deploy in this paper are gleaned from Judith Butler's idea of performative negativity, Ned Lebeau's insights into the pluralities of identity, Mervyn Frost's Hegelian-inspired insights into the constitutive ethics of practices and the transformative dynamics of dialectics. But most particularly, I draw on Fiona Jenkins' engagements with an ethics of being in common without identity in aesthetic experience and its role in negotiating the problematics and possibilities of mutual recognition. My painting titled Between Here and There is visually arresting, but difficult to describe. Consisting of an intricate web of dynamic fractals that pulse and quiver, some of us might struggle to identify what we are seeing. Is this a body part or a landscape? Simultaneously a field of dynamic folds and a portal. This painting registers both spatial extension and inwardness, body and landscape, figure and ground. And I start by noting an important proviso. An ethics of being in common without identity does not reside in any description of the aesthetic effects of works of art. The ethical force only appears through each viewer's encounter and interpretive experience of such artwork, or via the artist's creative processes in making it. Yet we do and can bring concepts and words to our experiences, and in the interest of illuminating what is at stake here, I offer some thoughts on my struggles, both creative and interpretive, to address that pluralizing aesthetic spectrum between affect, sense, and verbal representation that opens us up to the risky potential of mutual recognition. So, for example, in this painting, titled In It Together, which emerged from my encounter with the early morning light illuminating the cliffs of Marangi Bay near Auckland in New Zealand. That encounter itself was framed as a set of recognitions of the call of the landscape on my imagination, where the landscape itself seemed to have a form of agency, and where this call metaphorically resonated with my sense of being a part of a whole that was not me. As such, I understand this painting unsettles the distinctions between body and landscape, self and not self, inside and outside. Furthermore, this painting also confounds our expectations for a recognizable subject. This double-faced figure looks both backwards and forwards, and simultaneously reads as a hybrid figure and a landscape. Aesthetically, the viewer is caught up in a process that slides across cognition, affect, cultural expectation, and norms. Or to say it differently, the viewer is provoked into risking an imaginative, affective, and disordering experience that exceeds his or her cognitive mastery. It is via such aesthetic processes, I suggest, that the viewer takes up the problematics and possibilities of mutual recognition, and in so doing is inscribed into an ethics of being in common without identity. Furthermore, this painting, In It Together, demonstrates something of an object agency or a liveliness lodged in the ever proliferating folds and flows of what I call a non-identical life force that shapes a reciprocal and ever-folding relation between the landscape, myself, the artwork, you, the viewer, to produce a sense of co-relational psychic inwardness. Marianne Milner's psychoanalytic insights are instructive here. I quote, "The problem of the relation between the painter and his world then is basically a problem of one's own need and the needs of the other, a problem of reciprocity between you and me and with you and me," meaning originally mother and child. Peter Fuller argues that such an ethics of recognition has been eclipsed ever since the Renaissance by the individualizing and territorializing effects of fixed point perspective in painting, and by the subsequent emphasis on form and genre in art, which extend to what he called those post-structuralist tendencies to art in terms of power, ideology, and representation. From a psychoanalytically inclined aesthetic perspective, Fuller makes claims to the value of art being lodged in something like an ethics of being in common without identity, whose origins are lodged in those pre-conscious and psychically foundational struggles with the problems of reciprocity that each of us risk in our own neediness in the context of another's power and need. For Judith Butler and Fiona Jenkins, that risky dialectic is also tied up with an ethics of recognition lodged in sensate practices. Drawing on Hannah Arendt's ideas of the politics of public performances, Butler has argued for the potential of what she calls a sensate democracy, to critique those power relations that sustain inequality, injustice, and identity. For example, Butler cites forms of public activism like singing the American national anthem in Spanish as a form of dissident collectivity, or an ecstatic sociality, realized as a collective and pluralizing being in common that contests the power strategies of hegemonic authority and fixed identity. Whereas Jenkins explores the intricate and subtle interface of war poetry to explore an ethics of reciprocity, or what she calls a being in common without identity, in which our engagements with art and poetry exceed those philosophical language games that sustain identity and logos, to undo the self and to suspend thinking. For Jenkins, such a sense-based ethics of reciprocity involves, quote, traversing the impossible via an oscillating interface between oppositions. Seen in this way, artworks set up a dynamic and pluralizing interface that stages a reciprocal ethics of mutual recognition within each viewer as he or she grapples with his or her responses to such provocation. As such, certain works of art are philosophically impossible and inhabit an impossible dialectical object agency that invites an ethics of being in common without identity across multiple differences. That invitation, I suggest, is not confined to genre or to culture. It is offered by those artworks and sense-based practices that resist the cognitively and normatively patrolled borders that regulate many of our social interactions. My claim is that such an ecstatic sociality can be realized in several practices and processes like love, faith, compassion, sexuality, even in practices of encounter like waiting in hospitals, as Lisa Barriesta has argued, and in many genres and mediums of art, from popular culture to classical music, all of which invite audiences and individuals to risk the precariousness of an ethics of being in common without identity that is inclined towards reciprocity and not mastery. For example, Zanele Mohole's photographic practice, recently on show at Tate Modern, was framed as a subversive art practice that foregrounds LGBTQIA+ identity politics to raise awareness of injusticeness and aims to educate and create positive visual histories for under and misrepresented LGBTQAI+ communities. The first part of Mohole's exhibition included photographs and video artworks of individuals who have suffered because of their sexual orientations, ranging from corrective rape to physical violence and othering. On view were images that celebrate sexual difference, portraits of moments of intimacy, etc. But the work I want to talk about here is this selection of an ongoing collective portrait of approximately 500 faces titled Faces and Phases, that was also on show at Tate Modern. and is something of an archive which commemorates and celebrates the lives of Black lesbians, transgender and non-conforming individuals. Yet my experience of that vast work exceeded such cognitively and politically accessible verbal framings. I found myself being both effectively and compassionately taken up by a sense of all these faces, their bodies, their uniqueness, their vulnerability, their pride, which as an ensemble had its own image object agency. That sensate critique made me feel as if I was simultaneously estranged from their representations of these individuals and also somehow part of them. And the effective shock of such recognition entirely changed my otherwise dutiful appreciation of the political achievements of this body of work. In crossing that border, or becoming in common without identity with those anonymous photograph subjects, my presumptions about the LGBTQAI+ project have been irrevocably changed by the such disordering aesthetic experience. So in conclusion, I've sketched something of the transformative potential of those artworks and sense-based processes that experientially engage the problematics of mutual recognition and of encounter. Such a pluralizing and aesthetically motivated practicing of commonality is not only at odds with the fixities and fears of identity politics, but is also not available to rational or purposive reason, nor even to description. Instead, such an ethics of being in common without identity is necessarily tied to the risky, dialectical, and performative dynamics of those practices that span and wrestle with contradiction and difference. So in the context of this conversation about commonality and solidarity, I suggest that an aesthetically motivated ethics of being in common without identity, realized in art and sense-based practice, cannot be subsumed into the idea of solidarity, which I understand, and I might be wrong, I think we'll probably talk a lot about that, eschews the productive, problematic dynamics of contradiction in favor of the order of identarian ethics, or being in common with identity. I do not think that in the context of this conference's focus on order and disorder and but I do think in the context of this conference's focus on order and disorder and technological threats to security, a reappraisal of the pluralizing ethics of being in common without identity, lodged in multiple practices of encounter that transform and provoke us to engage with the problematics and possibilities of mutual recognition, is long overdue. So thank you very much. And I give over to Carolina to take you further. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lola. And thank you to the conference organizers, to Lizzie for all the tech work, to Rebekka and Maria for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here on this brilliant panel today. In my presentation, I will take a slightly different perspective and will ask if and how feminist care ethics helps us to reimagine foreign policy so that acting in solidarity actually becomes possible in the global realm. And to answer that question, I will first outline how foreign policy is understood traditionally. I will then consider how this traditional understanding limits the possibilities for acting in solidarity with others. And finally, I will explore how feminist care ethics might allow us to rethink foreign policy in a way that solidarity becomes possible. And the aim of my talk today is really to challenge those taken for granted assumptions that we normally make about foreign policy making, and to offer just one way of reimagining global relations and communities. So let me start out by outlining how foreign policy is understood traditionally. And by traditionally, I mean really the existing doxa that guides foreign policy making globally, so the taken for granted, unquestioned truths, if you will. And the current doxa of foreign policy making has been summarized quite brilliantly, I think, by David Campbell. He wrote in 1998 that we, so international relations scholars, but also practitioners, regularly understand, and I quote here, foreign policy as the external deployment of instrumental reason on behalf of an unproblematic identity. So in this short sentence, we find three aspects that are really central for the purposes of my talk today. First, foreign policy is always outward facing. It is directed at another. Second, foreign policy is about instrumental decision-making, and it's a means to an end to realize a state's objectives. And third, foreign policy is an expression of a pre-given and settled national identity. So in other words, foreign policy is rooted really in this understanding of a clearly delineated inside or nation acting towards a clearly delineated outside or foreign. And although this traditional understanding of foreign policy has long been questioned by international relations scholars, including Campbell himself, it is still very much dominant in practitioner circles. And let me just illustrate this with an example from my own research in German foreign policy. And I want to suggest that we look at a quote from an article published by the German Foreign Office, where it speaks about the guiding principles of German foreign policy. And I quote, "As a trading nation, Germany has a particular interest in an effective external economic policy that helps companies to tap into international markets and to improve the conditions for doing business," end quote. And quite obviously, German national identity is here described as that of a trading nation. So Germany, the trading nation, has particular interests that follow from that, and that must be realized through foreign policy means vis-a-vis other states, which is in this case, gain and improve access to international markets. And decision-making processes in the Foreign Office are then oriented towards that aim. And this is but one illustration of how foreign policy is still very much understood as outward-facing, as instrumental decision-making expressing a national identity. So what then does all of that really mean for the possibility of solidarity in and through foreign policy? And to answer that question, I would like to first define solidarity. And for the purposes of this talk, I understand it as relating to others with empathy while recognizing difference in equality. And this means that solidarity is about a connection between the self and an other. The self and the other are related, but they're distinct, and they are equal in difference. And this is a fundamental assumption taken from Black feminist thought. So solidarity means really relating to others as equals, but in recognition that differences among people matter. And solidarity is also about relating with empathy. And by empathy, I mean a process in which the person or persons, and I quote Liz Blondai's work here, imaginatively enters into the experiential world of others. So it's really about the proverbial standing in someone's shoes. So if solidarity is relating to others with empathy while recognizing difference in equality, can this be realized within this traditional doxa of foreign policy as an outward-facing, instrumental decision-making process that expresses a settled national identity? I think in light of the current global pandemic, this question is really more relevant than ever. And indeed, claims to solidarity have abounded in the past year and a half. However, I would argue that acting in solidarity is very much limited by how we traditionally understand and make foreign policy. And why is that so? I think the traditional understanding of foreign policy relies on an exclusionary idea about what national identity is. It limits expressions of solidarity to distant others, and it understands solidarity as a means to an end. But let me elaborate on these 3 points. So the traditional understanding of foreign policy limits our ability to relate to others with empathy, because after all, it's about expressing one's national identity, and this makes it rather difficult to stand in someone else's shoes, right? In theory, however, solidarity could be expressed if it was part of the national identity. But who is this nation? And is national identity ever settled? I would argue not. Let's turn again to Germany. Here, ideas of the nation are deeply intertwined with whiteness. However, people are currently struggling against this. And just one example of that occurs in the Foreign Office, where employees of color have recently founded a staff network. And they argue for greater representation of people of color in German foreign policy. And this, I think, goes beyond questions of inclusion, of career progress, of visibility, because it is really about the question of who belongs to the German nation, and can therefore legitimately represented towards the outside. So national identity is very much not settled. It is in constant flux, and there are struggles over who gets to define what it means. And relatedly, defining solidarity in and through foreign policy is also a constant struggle. What's more, the traditional understanding of foreign policy only allows us to express solidarity toward distant others. That is, people separated from the nation, both in terms of their identity, but also in terms of space. But what about those within the state? During the pandemic, we have seen exceptionally high levels of deaths of older people, of working class citizens, of people of color, and other traditionally marginalized groups globally. We've also seen a significant decline in equity because socially crucial work, including medical care, care for elders and children, and homeschooling, have mostly fallen on the shoulders of workers, of women, of people of color. And all of this is not visible in the doxa of foreign policy because it is not part of the foreign, of the outside, and hence solidarity cannot be directed here. And finally, the understanding of foreign policy as an instrumental decision-making process risks that solidarity is only extended when it serves larger foreign policy objectives and discarded again when it doesn't. A prominent example of this is the current debate about the TRIPS waiver. The TRIPS is an agreement about intellectual property rights between member states of the World Trade Organization. In the current pandemic situation, temporarily suspending specific aspects of the TRIPS that are related to vaccines and other COVID technologies would really help speed up the global pandemic response quite significantly. However, the majority of global North states is currently blocking the waiver, including Germany. And here we see that economic foreign policy interests take precedence over acting in solidarity, and this is very much in line with the traditional foreign policy doxa and comes out of it. So what I'm suggesting here is that the traditional doxa of doing foreign policy very much does not enable us to act in solidarity with others. And this is why I think we need to reimagine foreign policy and its relation to solidarity. And I do think that feminist care ethics provides one way of doing that. So feminist ethics have very recently interstate discourses when a number of states, including Sweden, Canada, Mexico, and Spain, adopted feminist foreign policies. In this presentation, however, I'm not really interested in those state policies. I'm happy to talk about those further after the discussion. But for now, I'm rather interested in the longer trajectory of feminist thinking on foreign policy that came out of this feminist care ethics perspective. And I'm building on Fiona Robinson's work here. And I want to read out a slightly longer quote from her article on feminist care ethics and foreign policy, where she defines feminist care ethics, and I quote, as a form of moral responsiveness that is curious about context and sees moral dilemmas and difference through the prism of relationship. It challenges all forms of hierarchy which divide people and work against the possibility of relationship. It is, finally, a democratic ethic that presumes relational subjects engaged in ongoing participation in civic life as both givers and receivers of care, end quote. So to summarize this admittedly rather long quote, what feminist care ethics is really about is that it centers relationality, it challenges hierarchies, and it works towards a world in which we equally give and receive care. Now, what would this mean for our understanding of foreign policy? I would like to suggest that such a feminist care ethics perspective radically challenges the traditional understanding of foreign policy for three reasons. First, it collapses the artificial distinction between the inside or the nation and the outside or the foreign through its emphasis on relationality. It makes visible how those two spatial domains and the people in them are intimately connected. And this allows to relate to others independently of their spatial location. Second, and relatedly, feminist care ethics dissolves this notion of a settled national identity because the self and the other are constituted through relationships. they cannot exist independently of or prior to these constituting acts. And this then also allows to recognize difference in equality. For feminist care ethics enables us to understand that one perspective is not the only one, and that it comes from the way we're situated in the broader global context. So quite simply, feminist care ethics allows us to be humble and to listen. And third, feminist care ethics, I think, opens up the possibility for centering empathy and care towards others, because people receive and give care as they relate to each other. And this, in my view, challenges the inbuilt hierarchies in traditional foreign policy making most fundamentally. Now, to summarize, feminist care ethics allows us to reimagine foreign policy in a way that expressing solidarity is possible. It enables us to relate to others with empathy while recognizing difference and maintaining equality. And I think this is very much needed, not just in the context of a global pandemic, but beyond. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion, and I'm going to hand over to Eitan now.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Rebekka and Maria and the communication team, Lizzie and Aisha, for all your support in putting this panel together. I'd like to share my screen now and talk a little bit about solidarity by taking the mind's perspective. I wonder if you can all see my slides. All right, since I haven't had it. Otherwise, I'll assume that you do see the slide. So often solidarity is being associated with group behavior. And I believe that despite that, solidarity has its origins at the level of the individual mind. And as we will see today, the mind poses some serious challenges for it. And so drawing on my own research in threat perception and then others' research in risk perception and in neuroscience and psychology, I'll first share my understanding of the notion of solidarity before discussing how the mind does it. And then I'll try and sketch rather roughly 3 principles of what we might term effective solidarity, hoping that this would help us reimagine communities as we move to the post-pandemic world. And so solidarity, for the purpose of today's talk, I think entails 3 key elements. The first element, that it's about a connection to entities outside ourselves, right? It's not about ourselves, it's something else out there. And this connection could be either to people, groups, it could be to animals, it could be to a certain place, so say a religious site, planet Earth, a piece of national territories, and indeed other entities as well. The second element in solidarity is that it involves a certain cause, whether political, social, moral, or environmental. It involves our own readiness to either defend or advocate a certain cause. And finally, and relatedly, I think that solidarity requires a sense of agency, a sense that by acting on the world, I can bring a certain positive effect onto it. Without this sense, we often resort to apathy. And so today, I'd like to focus mostly on the first element, that is the connection to other entities. And so how does the mind form connections to entities out there? And here I draw mostly on the work of Tanya Singer, neuroscientist, literary scholar, Elaine Scarry, and Paul Slovic and Paul Bloom, both psychologists. And so I'd like to claim today that the ways in which our minds are doing solidarity are in ways that are very biased, insensitive to numbers. And over the long term, facing large-scale suffering, they're also quite unsustainable. And to explain what I mean, let me focus on specifically on 3 challenges that the mind has for connecting with other entities in the world. So the first challenge is really the challenge of distance. Either in space, in time, or in identity, distance is central to the loss of feeling and connectedness. And let's take an example with space. Think about the difference that in how much you care about a deadly terrorist attack, a few minutes walk from where you now live, and a similar terrorist attack happening thousands of miles away. All else being equal, the farther we are from an incident, the less likely we would be to care about that incident. And distance in time can similarly hinder our sense of connection. Generally, the farther we are from an event in time, the less we care about it. The impact of distance on our ability to connect can also be seen in terms of identity. The more different an entity appears to you, the less likely you are to be and act in solidarity with it. And the suffering of animals, I think, is a case in point. We think they're very different from us, and hence we allow ourselves to do horrible things to them. And crucially, in that context of identity, we care less about members of other groups. We know from experiments that white, Black, and Asian participants show empathic resonance when watching an in-group's member's hand being pricked by a pin. But this response is dampened or sometimes even completely absent when the hand belongs to an out-group member. And the impact of group identity on solidarity is even more salient when groups are in direct competition, so conflict. In those situations, we not only experience less empathy towards distressed out-group members, we sometimes might even take pleasure in their pain. And this have been documented again and again in neuroscientific experiments. So distance in time, space, and identity plays a role in impeding our sense of connection to outside entities. In other words, our sense of connection to entities is highly biased. The second challenge for solidarity is what scholars have called psychic numbing. When faced with the need to empathize with an increasing number of beings worthy of our care, we tend to feel less empathy, or our capacity to feel empathy diminishes. And to think about one example, the official death toll from the global pandemics now stands at more than 3.5 million lives. Yet most of us find it very difficult to feel any real difference between 3.5 and say 3.4 million lives lost. That is, with increasing number of casualties, psychic numbing takes hold. And this is really the second challenge that we face. The very first life at risk is crucially important. We do care a lot about the individual's personal life. But when confronted with large numbers of casualties, we tend to lose this feeling. In simple terms, the more who die, the less we care. The third challenge for solidarity is related, and that is, in some circumstances, again, when faced with the need to empathize with many beings worthy of care, we experience the collapse of compassion, actually becoming less concerned, less prone to take effective action as the numbers of life at stake increases. And a famous study demonstrated this point rather effectively. The study gave people who had just participated in a paid psychological experiment the opportunity to donate up to $5 of their earning to the charity Save the Children. In one condition, participants were asked to donate to feed an identified victim, a 7-year-old girl from Mali named Rokia. And participants in a second group were asked to donate to the same girl, but were also shown statistics of starvation in several African countries, millions of other children in need. Now, this simple act of sharing these troubling statistics alongside the individual story reduced contributions to Rokia by about 40%. What's going on here? Faced with the need to care for many people, we tend to respond by withdrawing from the situation. And if you want to know how many people exactly, then follow-up study found that the collapse of compassion actually begins with groups as small as 2 people. And so this desensitization just described occurs when we contemplate different kinds of numerical information, whether it's related to starvation, global pandemics, or casualties of war. Faced with our sense of seeming inability to make a meaningful contribution, we tend to look away. And so we've just described 3 challenges: distance, psychic numbing, and compassion fade. And I claim that these pose serious challenges to our ability to form connections to other entities, connections that are impartial, reasoned, and sustainable, especially in the face of large-scale harm or suffering. Now, the problem is that left to their own devices, these psychological challenges can hinder effective response to harm. And assuming that we do want to live in a society in which people care about salient issues and feel like they can make a positive difference in the world, the question then arises, how can we overcome these challenges? How can we form better, more meaningful, reasoned, and sustainable connections? And to overcome these challenges, I think we need to become better, or at least consider these 3 major principles that together could be termed effective solidarity. And these principles, I think, ought to be applied by everybody, individuals and policymakers alike. And so let me try to briefly explain what I mean by each. Let's take the first principle. So we've just seen that we are very much biased towards the here and now. And we need to educate ourselves on how to critically evaluate dangers and suffering in ways that are less biased. And one way of doing so is really to try and zoom out from the present and look into the future. And to give a sense of why the future should matter, take a look at the figure on the screen. So looking 50,000 years back and forward in time, all humans ever lived are represented by the small gray circle. All humans alive today are represented by the even smaller green circle, and projections with same population rates as today, you can see that the unborn generations are represented by the much, much bigger orange circle. So when thinking about how to prioritize security threats and existential risk, we might want to take these future generations' lives into account and start holding both ourselves and our policymakers accountable to them. And in this context, I'd like to share what 2 researchers have termed the Intergenerational Solidarity Index, which really tries to gauge how much different nations provide for the well-being of future generations. And made up of 10 indicators of social, environmental, and economic solidarity, the index gives each country a score ranging from 1, that's very low on intergenerational solidarity, to 100, that's very high. And so this is the kind of things we can start doing in order to critically think about both future dangers and suffering. Relatedly, I think because we are highly biased in the ways in which we connect to the entities in the world, we ought to try and balance by actively caring more for strangers, what we perceive to be strangers, and to deal with extreme inequalities that exist in our societies today. And one way to do so, again, both individually and on a political level, is to donate more and better, either with our money, our time, skills, and so on. And we need to choose our charities in a better way. We need to choose charities that make sustainable, meaningful impact in areas of most importance. And in this context, I couldn't recommend more these 2 platforms, Effective Altruism and GiveWell, which really do exactly that, try and research evidence-based what charities do the most effective work in those areas that really demand our utmost attention. Now, at the level of the nation state, we ought to give better and more as well, again, in a sustainable and efficient way. And in this context, there's a lively debate now in the UK and in other countries as well. The 0.7 target set by the United Nations about the official development aid as a percentage of the national gross income, that's 0.7, is quite dismal, I think, all too low, and we can do much better than this. I think at the end of the day, we all need to ask ourselves, where do we want to see ourselves in this equation? How much we want to give to ourselves, to allocate to ourselves, to our group or tribe, and how much do we want to do the same for others? And it's an individual choice that we all have to make. The second principle that I'd like to suggest is that we have to understand these psychological challenges that I've just described, and we need to engage in reason alongside feeling whenever facing large-scale suffering or existential risks or dangers. So an example in the context of human suffering, we've just seen that we have a natural tendency to care less about the death of many. And that in some cases, when faced with large-scale suffering, we tend to look away, right? These are the second and third challenges that we mentioned. That's the figure on the top of the screen. Now, normatively, if we think and agree that all human lives have the same equal value, then the value of protecting lives should increase in a straight line as the number of lives at risk increases. And that's the figure on the bottom. And so understanding these psychological challenges coupled with engaging reason alongside feeling are crucial, I think, in moving forward. Finally, we might want to learn how to better regulate our response, our sense of connection, again, in the face of large-scale suffering and threats. One key in doing so is the distinction, or how to distinguish between emotional empathy and compassion. And this is crucial both for the ways, again, that individuals and policymakers operate. And so what's the difference between these two? Emotional empathy is the ability to feel what the other feels, to share in their pain. The problem with it, that over time, when facing, again, large-scale suffering, and when the other is experiencing overwhelmingly negative emotions, it is often very difficult to sustain over a long period of time. And I'm sure we all have our experiences in that context. And so in order to avoid this excessive sharing of suffering that might lead us to distress and lack of effective action, one way to respond to the suffering of others would be with compassion. In contrast to empathy or emotional empathy, compassion does not mean sharing the pain of others. Instead, it's about caring about another without feeling their pain. Associated with a sense of active presence and warmth and concern and determination to find a way and help the other's well-being, compassion isn't as exhausting as emotional empathy. And it does not make you withdraw, but actually to approach. And the good news is that building on this research cited here on the slide, there are fairly straightforward ways we can start doing that, regulate our responses to this large-scale suffering. Thank you very much, and I'd like to invite all of the speakers back in the chairs so we can engage in conversations and Q&A.
Thank you very much, Eitan, and thank you to Lola and Caroline as well for 3 really excellent and thought-provoking presentations. I'm sure we'll have a lot to discuss. So as Maria and I have mentioned already, we have some we have some questions for you, and these are a mix of general questions for all of you and questions for the speakers individually, before we'll then turn it to our audience today. So our first question is for the entire panel, and that question is a very broad one. What is solidarity? Do we need to rethink this notion? And if so, in what way? So anyone who'd like to start, we don't need to go in the order of the presentations.
Well, I'll start. Seeing I was the most provocative, saying that I distinguish this ethics of being in common without identity from solidarity. And that implied in that is a big question, given that, solidarity, as my two co-authors, two co-panelists have so eloquently argued, is such an incredibly valued ethics. So, and I was puzzling about it. I don't really know. I mean, I think solidarity it's a fantastic topic, and we really do need to expand it and think about it. I was very taken by Eitan's, Carolina's as well, of course, but more recently with Eitan's discussion of solidarity and how we should think about, we should take it seriously, and we should remember it all the time. But I was thinking all the time in relation to the ethics of being in common without identity, that both Eitan's and Carolina's talks were about a kind of purpose of reason. I mean, about thinking through the ethics of solidarity. And I think the argument that I was making is that we can be in common even without that reason. We can be in common through sense-based practices, through practices of compassion, through practices of art, through practices of love, all of which are, in a sense, a kind of problematic. So I guess the question that we might want to think about is, to what extent is solidarity a problematic? Is it something that's fixed, or is it a problematic?
Caroline, would you like to add some comments on this question?
And thanks, Lola, for going first and for sharing your thoughts on that. I have been thinking about this question quite a lot, also in response to both of your brilliant talks, and in relation to my own research, where really solidarity is something that is, in the foreign policy world, often spoken about either as a claim, so a mere, discursive position taking, if you will, that is sometimes followed up with action, but not always, and particularly that is something that has particularly been discussed in relation to feminist foreign policy. So has the adoption of a feminist foreign policy made a difference here or not? But also, what I was also thinking is that solidarity is something in foreign policy that, of course, offers, when we link it to national identity in this traditional foreign policy doxa, that offers sort of guidelines, right? So it tells us who should we extend our solidarity to, and who maybe not, and it allows us to make quite rational decisions about all of that. And still, I think it's limited. And I was quite intrigued by Lola's idea about this being in common without identity, and what you talked about, but also Eitan, your your suggestions and how we might rethink solidarity, because it has all those limitations, and those might be aggravated, particularly on the nation state level. So something that has also been suggested in light of this feminist foreign policy discourse is to turn to the notion of social justice instead, and work with that, because that has a very different, say, intellectual history. Social justice is more associated with the Black feminist tradition, for instance, and it focuses more on actual change and structural change. And in foreign policy, I think this might allow us to leave behind this sort of mere discursive claiming of solidarity, and to focus on, well, what can we do, and how might we have to rethink foreign policy in a way that we can make change. So these are just my sort of very initial 2 cents to start us off. Eitan, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this food for thought. I think I want to make 2 points in this context. The first is that solidarity is a beautiful thing, right? When I look back on my life and I try to kind of find out what were the most inspiring moments than most of them were experienced in group settings, where we worked towards a certain cause that I believed in. And so it's a very powerful, I think, notion. And it really speaks to our ability to step outside ourselves and connect with something that is larger than ourselves. And is there anything more beautiful than that? And it feels really good. But I think that we've seen throughout history, time and again, that it can work both ways, right? It can lead to either very moral actions and consequences and quite immoral. So my point is, I think that we ought to be very careful and selective about it, especially because we're prone to these biases, innumeracy, and unsustainability with our ability to defend or advocate certain causes. And the second point that I'd like to make is that we currently are very much fixed on causes related to other humans, which is perhaps understandable. So to give some data to support this point, in the United States, 97% of philanthropy goes to causes associated with other humans, and 3% goes to both environment and animals. And considering the biases that we've just surveyed, I think we need to try and find a better balance, to think not only about those people that are alive today, but future generations as well. And so there's a few things that we could do. And maybe just a final comment to pick on what Lola mentioned, this maybe dichotomy between reason and feeling or experience. And I very much agree with you, Lola. I think that there's a large role for art and experiences to play in the ways that we do solidarity. But maybe I will try and kind of press further that in addition to these experiences, and which are transformative in many cases and are very helpful, you might want to still maintain our reason and try to think about things in an analytical, maybe even utilitarian point of view. So that would be my own 2 cents. Thank you.
So my first question is for Lola. In your research, you propose a very beautiful and radical idea. And it would be really interesting to hear you reflect a bit more on the tension between different identities. Does the tension that exists between different individual identities within ourselves prevent us from being in common without identity? Lola, you're muted.
Thank you. Very, very interesting question. I've approached the problem of identity very much from the perspective of what Ned Lebow talks about, identity being plural, and that when we try and, that all of us are ineluctably plural within ourselves, so that identity is, multiple identities are part and parcel of what it is to be human. And that's so to be, and he goes on to say that identity has become a big feature of modernity, precisely because we are always caught up between our own individual reflexivity and the social pressure put on us as individuals. So that's the sort of ground of the tension that we have to negotiate. He's got a quite an interesting model of four categories of identity. I won't go into those, but it seems to me that if we are multiple all the time, we are always, in a sense, poised, first of all, between the politics of identity. All of us are, to some extent, interested in the politics of identity. But I'm also trying to make the case that we should be much more interested in an ethics of being without identity, and that tension between the politics of identity and the ethics of being without identity are themselves constitutive, in a sense, of our being in modernity. And that I'm trying to bring forward this capacity of ours to tolerate multiplicity within ourselves and to positively embrace the business of being without identity. It's a difficult, risky project, a radical project, as you say. I think it's a project that is very much taken up in art. I think it's one of the prime values of art. And I would hope that a social science audience might be quite intrigued by it, especially in the relation to, well, this topic of order and disorder, which is itself this dynamic dialectical topic. What is the relation between order and disorder? What is the relationship between identity and without identity, being in common without identity? I think that those are all dynamic tensions that enable us to think and feel through our mutual co-constitution. Is that's really what I mean, I took that as a kind of starting point for this dynamic, this dialectical process, as I understand it. And that to come back to your question is, you know, I don't think that having this multiplicity within us inhibits us in any way from having practices of identity and practices of being in common without identity, that each one of us has to negotiate that in terms of who we are and what challenges confront us. So I'm making a contribution to identity, to the considerations of identity, to bring in the ethics of it. I think it's a very important, valuable ethics that appears in art, but I also think it appears in many other practices, traditional. And I was very interested. I was on a Zoom conference last week where they're talking about pretty much the same kind of thing, the ethics of waiting in hospitals in this COVID time, and that the ethics of being in care with one another was itself a kind of ethics of being in common without identity. So it's an ethics that is lodged in many of our practices.
Great. And in the interest of time, we'll just ask one more question. Sorry, we don't have enough time to ask our individual question to both Eitan and Caroline. But I'll just ask the question then for Caroline, since she was next on the list. What does a feminist foreign policy that has gone through a pluralizing transformation look like? How does it differ from a feminist foreign policy that is grounded in Western cosmopolitan values?
Thanks, Becca, and I'll try to keep it short in the interest of time. I think what's important to say first is that we do have existing state feminist foreign policies, right? So that of Sweden, of Canada, France has claimed to have one, Spain, Mexico, Luxembourg, so there's quite a few around. But when you look at those state feminist foreign policies closely, it's quite obvious that none of those has gone through such a pluralizing transformation. So when they do make claims to specific ethics, these claims and the understanding of ethics is very much based in a Western cosmopolitan understanding of what ethics means. And I think you could sort of, one way of rephrasing the question that you just asked, Becca, is why do we need this feminist scare ethics perspective? Couldn't we just do an ethical foreign policy and then everything would be solved? And I would argue not, because I think, and I'm drawing on Fiona Robertson's work here again, that ethical foreign policy still stays within those boundaries of inside and outside, of universal in particular, and doesn't really dissolve those. Because we see that, for instance, with Canada, even where you have claims that you're making an ethical foreign policy and you're, for instance, elevating human rights over material gains, then you still have this discursive construction of a sort of paternal protective masculinity. So what happens in Canada, for instance, with the FIAP, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, is that it's very much directed at empowering women to access the international market. And Canada is discursively constructed as sort of the enabler of them doing so. And this very much then, I think, reproduces that inside-outside binary on the one hand. And the second point I just want to make very quickly is that the ethical remains attached to the cosmopolitan outside in those understandings of feminist foreign policy. And this very much reproduces, again, existing power relations and opens up the risk of feminist foreign policy being co-opted by capitalist, by patriarchal and racist logics, because it's so easy to construct the inside the state who has adopted the feminist foreign policy as the modern one, as the protector, and the outside as in need of saving or protecting in one way or another. And I think if we reimagine foreign policy through this feminist care ethics, what that allows us to do really is to center relationality and to look at context, but also revise and adapt to our foreign policy decisions as needed. So just being, basically it's a call for more uncertainty, I'm guessing. And it's a process that very much centers relating to others and listening to others. And I think that's what's very much needed.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caroline. So I see that we have audience members waiting with questions, and so we'll turn to them now. If we have time at the end, we'll get to our other questions on our list, but let's open it up to the audience now. I see that we have a first question from Francisco. Francisco, would you like to come join us and ask your question directly? Otherwise, we're happy also to read it for you. So please put your hand up if you'd like to ask your question. Okay, someone letting Francisco in? Okay, I'll go ahead and read the question. So we're still getting used to this virtual format. So a question from Francisco Lobo. Thanks very much, Francisco. Francisco's question is, thank you to all the presenters and organizers. I have a question for the entire panel. Do you believe we can use the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities taken from environmental law to apply it to solidarity more broadly? For instance, quote, common but differentiated solidarity duties, quote, depending on different capabilities and needs between countries. So just in case, I will put that in the chat box for the panelists so they can absorb it more individually. But who would like to answer that first? Perhaps, is it okay to call on Eitan since we didn't get to him with our third question? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Thank you for calling me out. I could try. I mean, it's quite far from what I do. But I think this is an interesting attempt, as much as I understand it from the question. It's an interesting attempt to think how we can do solidarity in more subtle ways, right? And how we can take into account the various capabilities and needs of different countries. And so, to me, from just now thinking about it, it does make sense, right? Because it operates on these various principles of justice, both equality and fairness. And so, I think there is potential here, but I'm afraid that in order to come up with something more meaningful, I'll have to think about this a little bit in more details.
Right. Thank you, Eitan. So do we have any more questions? I can't see any hands up. No, so when the focus is on Eitan, I actually had a question for you. So you proposed this notion of effective solidarity in your research. What does an ethics that comes out from effective solidarity as opposed to solidarity understood as empathy look like? And would effective solidarity change anything in terms of what it means to act in solidarity with others?
Yeah, thank you, Maria. So to reiterate, if our intuitive sense of connecting to others in the world is indeed biased, and if it's insensitive to numbers, and if it's unsustainable over the long run, then we need to come with ways that are less all those things, right? In ways that are impartial, that are sensitive to numbers and reason and sustainable. And And so following the framework that I've alluded to, the effective altruism, I think that effective solidarity might direct us to choose causes that are likely to be highly impactful. To the extent that the cause is first great in scale, that is, that it affects many lives by a great amount, that is highly neglected, meaning that other people, other groups, other organizations and states aren't working to address this problem. And third, that it's actually solvable and tractable. And if I put my own resources into this cause, then it would actually have meaning to it. So on the basis of this effective altruism reasoning, I think that the idea of effective solidarity can suggest three main avenues for effective action. And the first one is global poverty, right? Reducing global poverty is probably high on everyone's, should be high, everyone's on the agenda. And we know that COVID-19 has only pushed more than 100 million people, again, below the poverty line. So there is definitely that kind of area of high importance. And then the second one is improving animal welfare. And the third one is trying to influence long-term future. And here is where climate change enters. So if I have to think about certain ethics coming out of this idea of effective solidarity, that it's very similar to effective altruism. And for the second part of the question, I would like to suggest an analogy that might help us think about this notion more clearly. So if we think about solidarity as emotional empathy, then it's similar to holding a spotlight that really shines more brightly on those people we love and are similar to us, and gets much dimmer as we move away or farther towards people that are different from us. And as we've seen, this spotlight tends to get fixated as well on the individual rather than the many. And it's also very difficult to hold it. It has a very short life, shelf life. And so if we have to rethink how we do it and how would ethics of effective solidarity look like, I think that to use this analogy, we would use a spotlight that is much more diffused, that is directed at those causes that are most crucial, and where we can make the most impact. And we will not be, I think, swayed by the individual suffering, but again, to highlight the many over the one. And it will also, if we can manage this emotional regulation of our response, then we could probably also hold it for longer periods of time. So that's my thinking about how would ethics of effective solidarity might look like. Thank you.
Could I quickly add something to that, or do we need to move forward?
By all means, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Eitan. I was just thinking through how this is similar but different in the foreign policy world, because with foreign policy, what you have, and a lot of studies actually have highlighted this, is that the international realm is usually seen to be more progressive in terms of ethics, as opposed to the domestic. And particularly with notions such as solidarity that in the context of feminist foreign policy often revolve around questions of gender. It sometimes tries to sort of link the more progressive international back to the maybe less progressive domestic. So the spotlight here seems to be on something that's taken place elsewhere. So rather than so there's a different understanding of distance there and space, I think, what's at play. But it's very much something that is being struggled about at the moment. So with just taking the analogy, because I like it so much, like, who do we direct the spotlight to? Who do we extend solidarity to in feminist foreign policy is often quite limited. So even though we, like I said, we direct it towards the outside, but then we also only directed it specific groups of the population, and that's often cis women. And I think this is also something where, and this I think is related to what Lola said earlier, where specific notions of identity and identity constructions come in that that somewhat hinder our ability to relate to each other. And I think here what a really radical notion of feminist foreign policy would do is, like Lola suggested, try to center experiences more. And I think one way of doing that would be through empathetic listening and empathetic cooperation. And Christine Sylvester, among others, has written extensively on that. You know, I think Christine Sylvester developed that idea with regard to who actually gets to build theory. But I think it's something that can be applied here as well, where you sort of slip in and out of different positionalities because you listen to others, take them seriously in what they say, their concerns, their fears, their agendas, and you listen to those in particular who you usually don't listen to. So you direct your gaze at the margins. And I think this is something that might be a way of moving forward.
Excellent. Lola, Lola, I think you're muted, yeah.
There we go. Just to take up on that, because I think we're coming to some notion of what the value of solidarity is. I think Eitan has given us such a fantastic definition of it. I think that we're in a spectrum between the individual inner development of an ethical sensibility and the public, and I would say that they're on a spectrum, and that we need to attend to both. We need to attend to our everyday ethics and to encourage people to do them in sense-based practices, and hopefully that will make the solidarity with others in extreme suffering more. People would be more practiced in this kind of ethical endeavor.
Excellent. Well, we have one final question for the three of you, but first let's see if anyone in the audience has another question or even general comments or thoughts that were inspired by this panel. So if you have a question, please just raise your hand, or if you'd like us, and you can come in and say it yourself, or you can type it into the text box and we'll read it for you. So let me just pause for one moment, just so I'm making sure I'm not silencing anyone. So hard to know virtually what's happening behind the scenes. In that case, oh, I just raised my own hand. In that case, I will ask my final question. And if you think of any questions in the meantime, we'll make sure that we can give you a chance to do it at the very end. We'll cut our comments short if need be. So our final question is actually two questions that we combined into one for the interest of time, and also because our panelists have already partially answered our first question, just naturally by the way the conversation went. So the combined question, and this is for all three of you, is what potential does the notion of solidarity have in helping us to reimagine communities in times of disorder? Can it help us to guide political action? Or alternatively, is there a risk that conversations about solidarity may actually close off other avenues, such as political justice and responsibility? Is solidarity a prerequisite for these types of actions, or can solidarity actually have a more negative side, which is something we haven't discussed yet? So that's a long final question. You can answer any part of it that you'd like, of course. So should we start then with Caroline? I think.
Yeah. I'm happy to start, yeah, if that's okay. So I think I'd like to address sort of the second part, what the risky bits about solidarity are. And I think I want to, again, take it back to this idea of national identity. So I think if solidarity remains tied to identity, and in the case of foreign policy, particularly national identity, I think there is a real risk that thinking about other avenues, such as political justice, might be closed off. And I want to use Sweden as an example, if I may. So Sweden was the first state to adopt a feminist foreign policy in 2014, and has a long history of state feminism, but this sort of feminist foreign policy has added a new layer to their national identity, and that it is discursively constructed as exceptional, as a moral superpower. And one aspect that came with this feminist foreign policy part of the national identity is its emphasis that Sweden has never been a colonizer. So it discursively constructs itself as moral superpower because it takes in this feminist ethics, and part of this feminist ethics is that it doesn't oppress others. This is wrong, like quite wrong, because Sweden has colonized its own indigenous people. But because there are within the state, again, this is not part of that narrative. And I think solidarity very much is so much tied, so tight, well, tied so closely to this idea of national identity that you can't extend solidarity within that framework to everyone. It's very much limited. And I think political justice is something that will be needed here, but that is not possible. So I think we see sort of one really quite a big limitation of this feminist foreign policy idea, as it is tied to identity.
Yes, sure. I wanted to say that it seems as if what I'm proposing is not in the realm of justice, but I'm also simultaneously thinking that that's a weakness in my position. But what I do want to say is that it seems to me that in this sense-based field of ethics, that there is it is always in a sense practical. It is always based in senses. It's always based in practices of friendship, practices of love, practices of art, practices of being in common without identity across several forms of encounter, so that it's at the kind of micro level that I'm talking about rather than the macro level of justice. So yes, so I'll leave it there. I wouldn't have anything to say about justice.
Yeah. So I'll take the first part, and that is really the potential, and what potential, if any, does the notion of solidarity have in helping us to reimagine communities in times of disorder. I think it's quite important to keep in mind the context in which we are speaking right now, and maybe the next few months and years, and perhaps even more, are going to be very difficult times for many around the world. And so I think there ought to be an emphasis on the outside, the stranger, the far away, those that are unlike us, those that are yet to be born, especially in this kind of circumstance that we're going to find ourselves in. And so I do think that there is a great potential to this notion if, again, done well and effectively, to help us and to guide political action. And I think we're already seeing it. Again, this kind of debate that is going on in the UK about a rebellion by members of the Conservative Party against the Prime Minister for lowering the proportion of the ODA as is quite telling, I think. There is a move to do more for others, even those that are far away and different from us. And so I do hope that it would keep on guiding us. And And about the other conversations, I hope that it would actually help inspire these conversations about justice, fairness, equality, and their different iterations. So perhaps we can have these various conversations in tandem, not necessarily closing off any particular direction. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. I think we've had unless there are any last comments from our presenters or from the audience, I don't see any, then I think we've had a very rich and thought-provoking discussion, and it's given us a lot to think about. And really enjoyed hearing our three speakers and getting to know more about their work. And I think thank you to Maria and to Lizzie and the School of Security Studies for organizing such an excellent conference and on such an important and timely subject. So I really look forward to being able to see all of you in person in the next academic year. And I think in the meantime, there's a message here. In the meantime, yeah, we just have a couple minutes left, and Maria wanted to quickly walk you through the final steps and what to expect in terms of the blog posts coming out in relation to this conference as well. So thanks again for fantastic conversation today and giving us such rich and thought-provoking comments.
Right, thank you, Rebekka. Thank you, Eitan, Carolina, and Lola, and thank you all for tuning in. So as a final word, I'd encourage you all to check out the Research Center for International Relations blog. This week, we will publish 2 blog posts on the topic of solidarity, written by PhD students Carol-Louise Pryor and Laura Suber. We will also try to post these links, or the links of these blogs on our social media accounts, so you will be able to access their pieces from those platforms. Right?